show up, then I can't be held responsible.
Yeah.
Hello! Welcome to the Isolated Literary Society Presents Daily Austen. I will be picking up where we left off yesterday in Jane Austen's Emma. If for some strange reason you are watching this video without seeing any of the previous ones, there's a whole playlist of all the previous chapters you can go catch up on if you'd like. We will be reading chapter 33 today, and probably 34 as well. I realized today that there are 55 chapters in Emma. I was trying to figure out...
Bless you.
I was trying to figure out how many, videos to create on YouTube. I didn't want to make more than there were going to be chapters. And then I realized, the chapters are in Roman numerals, which always throws me off. And I'm like, oh yeah, after, is it 40? Is it after 50?
50 is, L.
Okay, yeah. 40 is XL and 50 is L.
Yes. Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense.
No, it's, that's the Romans for you.
So it's going to throw me off
that
even more.
Numbering system anymore.
I was like, how many chapters are there in this book? I flipped to the end and looked for the last chapter. It was like chapter LV. I'm like, why would you do this? Whoever decided to number these chapters this way. My edition of Pride and Prejudice has Arabic numbers, so I don't know why this one has Roman numbers. But I don't know if that's
to be, even more
being fancy,
esoteric.
I'm just rambling to give people a chance to get their little live notification on YouTube and maybe actually come over here, so they don't miss out.
Well, we might as well.
Oh, I'm gonna text my sister. She seems to be having a problem getting the the notifications. They're not like showing up on time. I will text her. Emma time! Exclamation point. All right. She has been informed. All right. Well, shall we begin chapter 33? See what more will happen with the strange and unusual Mrs. Elton. We have just met in the previous chapter, if you missed yesterday. Mr. Elton finally has been married and brought his new bride home, and she's a very curious character. A very interesting person.
Yes.
Very, very curious. All right. Emma was not required by any subsequent discovery to retract her ill opinion of Mrs. Elton. Her observation had been pretty correct. Such as Mrs. Elton appeared to her on the second interview, such she appeared whenever they met again. Self-important, presuming, familiar, ignorant, and ill-bred. She had a little beauty and a little accomplishment, but so little judgment that she thought herself coming with superior knowledge of the world to enliven and improve a country neighborhood, and conceived Miss Hawkins to have held such a place in society as Mrs. Elton's consequence only could surpass. Miss Hawkins is her unmarried name, just in case anyone's confused about that. Just want to make sure it's clear. There was no reason to suppose Mr. Elton thought at all differently from his wife. He seemed not merely happy with her, but proud. He had the air of congratulating himself on having brought such a woman to Highbury, as not even Miss Woodhouse could equal, and the greater part of her new acquaintance, disposed to commend, or not in the habit of judging, followed the lead of Miss Bates's goodwill, or taking it for granted that the bride must be as clever and as agreeable as she professed herself, were very well satisfied. So that Mrs. Elton's praise passed from one mouth to another, as it ought to do, unimpeded by Miss Woodhouse, who readily continued her first contribution, and talked with a good grace of her being very pleasant and very elegantly dressed. In one respect, Mrs. Elton grew even worse than she had appeared at first. Her feelings altered towards Emma. Offended probably by the little encouragement which her proposals of intimacy met with, she drew back in her turn, and gradually became much more cold and distant. And though the effect was agreeable,
Sorry.
It's okay. And though the effect was agreeable, the ill will which produced it was necessarily increasing Emma's dislike. Her manners, too, and Mr. Elton's, were unpleasant towards Harriet. They were sneering and negligent. Emma hoped it must be had been an offering to conjugal It was not to be doubted that poor Harriet's attachment had been an offering to conjugal unreserve, and her own share in the story, under a coloring at the least favorable to her and the most soothing to him, had in all likelihood been given also. Oh, that he would have, that he told Mrs. Elton the whole thing about.
Yeah, in a way that, in the best possible light for himself and
right,
the
yes,
worst possible for the others.
Of course.
Because what else?
He's a jerk. That's why. It was, where was I? When they had nothing else to say, it must be always easy to begin abusing Miss Woodhouse, and the enmity which they dared not show in open disrespect to her found a broader vent in contemptuous treatment of Harriet. Poor Harriet.
Yeah.
Really, her life has not been improved at all by her friendship with Emma.
Not really, no.
Mrs. Elton took a great fancy to Jane Fairfax, and from the first. Not merely when a state of warfare with one young lady might be supposed to recommend the other, but from the very first. And she was not satisfied with expressing a natural and reasonable admiration, but without solicitation or plea or privilege, she must be wanting to assist and befriend her. Before Emma had forfeited her confidence, and about the third time of their meeting, she heard all Mrs. Elton's knight-errantry on the subject. Jane Fairfax is absolutely charming, Miss Woodhouse. I quite rave about Jane Fairfax. A sweet, interesting creature, so mild and ladylike, and with such talents. I assure you, I think she has very extraordinary talents. I do not scruple to say that she plays extremely well. I know enough of music to speak decidedly on that point. Oh, she is absolutely charming. You will laugh at my warmth, but upon my word, I talk of nothing but Jane Fairfax, and her situation is so calculated to affect one. Miss Woodhouse, we must exert ourselves and endeavor to do something for her. We must bring her forward. Such talents as hers must not be suffered to remain unknown. I dare say you have heard those charming lines of the poet, "Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its fragrance on the desert air." We must not allow them to be verified in sweet Jane Fairfax. Here we have an illustration of Mrs. Elton reciting that bit of poetry. I can only assume, based on her character thus far, that that is a misquote.
Probably.
I'll have to look it up later to find out who that is a quote of and how wrong it is. "I cannot think there is any danger of it," was Emma's calm answer. "And when you are better acquainted with Miss Fairfax's situation, and understand what her home has been, with Colonel and Mrs. Campbell, I have no idea that you will suppose her talents can be unknown." "Oh, but dear Miss Woodhouse, she is now in such retirement, such obscurity, so thrown away. Whatever advantages she may have enjoyed with the Campbells are so palpably at an end. And I think she feels it. I'm sure she does. She's very timid and silent. One can see that she feels the want of encouragement. I like her the better for it. I must confess it is a recommendation to me. I am a great advocate for timidity."
In other people.
Sorry, in other people, apparently. "And I am sure one does not often meet with it. But in those who are at all inferior, it is extremely prepossessing. Oh, I assure you, Jane Fairfax is a very delightful character, and it interests me more than I can express." "You appear to feel a great deal, but I am not aware how you or any of Miss Fairfax's acquaintance here, any of those who have known her longer than yourself, can show her any other attention than—" "My dear Miss Woodhouse, a vast deal may be done by those who dare to act. You and I need not be afraid. If we set the example, many will follow it as far as they can, though all have not our situations. We have carriages to fetch and convey her home, and we live in a style which could not make the addition of Jane Fairfax at any time the least inconvenient. I should be extremely displeased if Wright were to send us up such a dinner as could make me regret having asked more than Jane Fairfax to partake of it. I have no idea of that sort of thing. It is not likely that I should, considering what I have been used to. My greatest danger, perhaps, in housekeeping may be quite the other way, in doing too much and being too careless of expense. Maple Grove will probably be my model more than it ought to be, for we do not at all affect to equal my brother, Mr. Suckling, in income. However, my resolution is taken as to noticing Jane Fairfax. I shall certainly have her very often at my home. Shall introduce her wherever I can. She'll have musical parties to draw out her talents, and shall be constantly on the watch for an eligible situation. My acquaintance is so very extensive that I have little doubt of hearing of something to suit her shortly. I shall introduce her, of course, very particularly to my brother and sister when they come to us. I am sure they will like her extremely, and when she gets a little acquainted with them, her fears will completely wear off, for there's really nothing in the manners of either but what is highly conciliating. I shall have her very often indeed, while they are with me, and I dare say we shall sometimes find a seat for her in the barouche landau in some of our exploring parties. Have I mentioned my brother has a barouche landau? I don't know what that is, but it sounds very fancy. And I can only imagine how this is aggravating Emma to have Mrs. Elton speak as if she and Emma are on the same footing in society.
Oh, yes.
Or in the same level of wealth.
Yes.
Which is definitely not the case.
Yeah.
Poor Jane Fairfax, thought Emma, you have not deserved this. You may have done wrong with regard to Mr. Dixon, but this is a punishment beyond what you can have merited. The kindness and protection of Mrs. Elton. Jane Fairfax and Jane Fairfax. Heavens, let me not suppose that she dares go about Emma Woodhousing me. But upon my honor, there seems no limits to the licentiousness of that woman's tongue. I think she's commenting on the fact that she always refers to her as Jane Fairfax and never as Miss Fairfax.
Oh, yeah.
It's like weird to refer to her full name because she says, let me not suppose she dares go about Emma Woodhousing me. Maybe it's considered rude.
Yeah, and
that she should refer to her as Miss Fairfax. I don't know.
And possibly unnecessary. I don't know.
Yeah, there's just so many comments on how society is supposed to go in these books that she doesn't bother to explain.
Right.
Every now and then she does explicitly say, like, she just met her and already, or she just met Mr. Knightley and already she's calling him Knightley.
Yeah.
That one was obvious, but this one is a little more subtle.
A barouche is a large, open, four-wheeled carriage, both heavy and luxurious, drawn by 2 horses.
But what is a barouche landau? I've heard of a barouche box, which I assume that is covered.
Yeah, probably.
I shall have
the type that you see
privilege to send you both there in the barouche box.
It's the type that you see horse-drawn carriages.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So just that,
like these days. I think I can.
I just have to assume from the context that it was, or at least she thought of it as being very fancy, like the fanciest kind.
So the barouche landau apparently has a top that can be put over it.
How's that different from a barouche box?
It probably isn't.
Well,
I should imagine. I could actually read the whole article.
Right, yeah.
But
Lady Catherine de Bourgh would probably say there is.
I mean, they could just be...
Or honestly...
I think that's the name of, like, the model.
Yeah. Well, there's so many subtleties in here. It could be that they're the same, and barouche box is, like, was considered, like, the proper term or something, and barouche landau was, like overly specific or something like that, you know?
Meghan Markle and Prince Harry rode away from their wedding in a barouche.
Oh, well. Mr. Suckling must be very fancy indeed.
Yes, indeed.
Anyway.
Anyway.
Emma had not to listen to such paradings again, to any so exclusively addressed to herself, so disgustingly decorated with a "Dear Miss Woodhouse." The change on Mrs. Elton's side soon afterwards appeared, and she was left in peace, neither forced to be the very particular friend of Mrs. Elton, nor, under Mrs. Elton's guidance, the very active patroness of Jane Fairfax, and only sharing with others in a general way in knowing what was felt, what was meditated, what was done. She looked on with some amusement. Miss Bates's gratitude for Mrs. Elton's attentions to Jane was in the first style of guileless simplicity and warmth. She was quite one of her worthies, the most amiable, affable, delightful woman, just as accomplished and condescending as Mrs. Elton meant to be considered. Emma's only surprise was that Jane Fairfax should accept those attentions and tolerate Mrs. Elton as she seemed to do. She heard of her walking with the Eltons, sitting with the Eltons, spending a day with the Eltons. This was astonishing. She could not have believed it possible that the taste or the pride of Miss Fairfax could endure such society and friendship as the vicarage had to offer. Well, Jane isn't as pretentious as you, Emma.
That's true.
She is a riddle, quite a riddle, said she, to choose to remain here month after month, under privations of every sort, and now to choose the mortification of Mrs. Elton's notice and the penury of her conversation, rather than return to the superior companions who have always loved her with such real, generous affection. Who are these superior companions she was referring to?
I think maybe herself. I don't know.
She has never loved Jane Fairfax with real, generous affection. She doesn't like Jane Fairfax.
Unless she's referring to like her living situation before. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Honestly,
that is
I don't know.
I think that's what she means. Why doesn't she go back
right
to be with the Campbells?
Right.
Because they would be superior companions to Mrs. Elton in Emma's view.
Yeah.
Also, I think probably most people's view, but
yeah.
For different reasons than Emma.
Yes.
Jane had come to Highbury professedly for 3 months. The Campbells were gone to Ireland for 3 months. But now the Campbells had promised their daughter to stay at least till midsummer, and fresh invitations had arrived for her to join them there. According to Miss Bates, it all came from her. Mrs. Dixon had written most pressingly. Would Jane but go, means were to be found, servants sent, friends contrive, no traveling difficulty allowed to exist. But still she had declined it. There's our answer.
Mm-hmm.
She must have some motive more powerful than appears for refusing this invitation, was Emma's conclusion. She must be under some sort of penance, inflicted either by the Campbells or herself. There is great fear, great caution, great resolution somewhere. She is not to be with the Dixons. The decree is issued by somebody. But why must she consent to be with the Eltons? Here is quite a separate puzzle. Well, because you won't hang out with her.
I know,
she's
right?
probably bored of her grandma and her aunt all the time.
Right.
Somebody wants to be friends
She's
with her.
going to be with someone chattering all the time. It might as well be.
Right, yeah.
Else.
Compared to her aunt, Mrs. Elton might seem like a fresh change of pace.
Yeah, it's at least a different kind of chattering.
Yes, exactly. Also, she's polite.
That too.
Jane Fairfax that's one of her deciding qualities. She
Yeah.
is sort of reserved and quiet and polite.
Yes.
She's
She
Pepper.
Everything that Emma is
I
not.
think Pepper has left us a little present.
It certainly smells like it.
Well, I simply must finish this chapter.
Yes.
Oh yes. Upon her speaking her wonder aloud on that part of the subject before the few who knew her opinion of Mrs. Elton, Mrs. Weston ventured this apology for Jane. We cannot suppose that she has any great enjoyment at the vicarage, my dear Emma, but it is better than being always at home. Her aunt is a good creature, but as a constant companion must be very tiresome. We must consider what Miss Fairfax quits before we condemn her taste for what she goes to. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You are quite right, Mrs. Weston, said Mr. Knightley warmly. Miss Fairfax is as capable as any of us of forming a just opinion of Mrs. Elton. Could she have chosen with whom to associate, she would not have chosen her. But, with a reproachful smile at Emma, she receives attentions from Mrs. Elton which nobody else pays her. Very pointed.
Burn.
Emma felt that Mrs. Weston was giving her a momentary glance, and she was herself struck by his warmth. With a faint blush, she presently replied, Such attentions as Mrs. Elton's, I should have imagined, would rather disgust than gratify Miss Fairfax. Mrs. Elton's invitations I should have imagined anything but inviting. I should not wonder, said Mrs. Weston, if Miss Fairfax were to have been drawn on beyond her own inclination by her aunt's eagerness in accepting Mrs. Elton's civilities for her. Poor Miss Bates may very likely have committed her niece and hurried her into a greater appearance of intimacy than her own good sense would have dictated, in spite of the very natural wish of a little change.
That's true.
Both felt very anxious to hear him speak again, and after a few minutes' silence, he said, Another thing must be taken into consideration, too. Mrs. Elton does not talk to Miss Fairfax, as she speaks of her. We all know the difference between the pronouns he or she and thou, the plainest spoken among us. We all feel the influence of a something beyond common civility in our personal intercourse with each other, something more early implanted. We cannot give anybody the disagreeable hints that we may have been very full of the hour before. We feel things differently. And besides the operation of this, as a general principle, you may be sure that Miss Fairfax awes Mrs. Elton by her superiority both of mind and manner, and that, face to face, Mrs. Elton treats her with all the respect which she has a claim to. Such a woman as Jane Fairfax probably never fell in Mrs. Elton's way before, and no degree of vanity can prevent her acknowledging her own comparative littleness in action, if not in consequence. "I know how highly you think of Jane Fairfax," said Emma. Little Henry was in her thoughts, and a mixture of alarm and delicacy made her irresolute what else to say.
Yes, of course. Little Henry.
We must think of little Henry. Yes, he replied. Anybody may know how highly I think of her. And yet, said Emma, being hastily and with an arch look, but soon stopping. It was better, however, to know the worst at once. She hurried on. And yet, perhaps you may hardly be aware yourself how highly it is. The extent of your admiration may take you by surprise some day or other. Mr. Knightley was hard at work upon the lower buttons of his thick leather gaiters, and either the exertion of getting them together or some other cause brought the color into his face as he answered, "Oh, are you there? But you are miserably behindhand. Mr. Cole gave me a hint of it 6 weeks ago." He stopped. Emma felt her foot pressed by Mrs. Weston, and did not know herself what to think. In a moment he went on. "That will never be, however, I can assure you. Miss Fairfax, I dare say, would not have me if I were to ask her, and I am very sure I shall never ask her." Emma returned her friend's pressure with interest, and was pleased enough to exclaim, "You are not vain, Mr. Knightley, I will say that for you." He seemed hardly to hear her. He was thoughtful, and, in a manner which showed him not pleased, soon afterwards said, "So you have been settling that I should marry Jane Fairfax?" "No, indeed, I have not. You have scolded me too much for matchmaking for me to presume to take such a liberty with you. What I said just now meant nothing. One says these sort of things, of course, without any idea of a serious meaning. Oh, no, upon my word, I have not the smallest wish for your marrying Jane Fairfax, or Jane anybody. You would not come in and sit with us in this comfortable way if you were married." Mr. Knightley was thoughtful again. The result of his reverie was, "No, Emma, I do not think the extent of my admiration for her will ever take me by surprise. I never had a thought of her in that way, I assure you." And soon afterwards, "Jane Fairfax is a very charming young woman, but not even Jane Fairfax is perfect. She has a fault. She has not the open temper which a man would wish for in a wife." Emma could not but rejoice to hear that she had a fault. "Well," said she, "and you soon silenced Mr. Cole, I suppose?" "Yes, very soon. He gave me a quiet hint. I told him he was mistaken. He asked my pardon and said no more. Cole does not want to be wiser or wittier than his neighbors." I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take a very brief break to see to
Oh, is that?
a little something that Pepper has made necessary.
No.
Please hold. I am going to just pause the
It's too much for you to bear. Huh?
Yeah, I can't handle it. Jeez, Pepper. You couldn't have waited until after the live stream?
I know.
Whew. We've got the windows open and everything. It's
I know.
so good. You can smell it too, right? It's not just me.
I definitely can. I might not smell it quite as strongly.
Ooh.
I could get the big we could get the big fan out.
Oh, Lord. Pepper, this poop is bigger than you are.
Oh God.
Just sit there looking all innocent. Yeah, open it. Get a cross breeze going. Woo! Okay. Anyone who listens to this on GarageBand later, or not GarageBand, but the audio I'm recording in GarageBand later.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Will not have to endure that little break. Okay. Oh, man.
There we go.
Be glad that those of you watching on YouTube cannot smell that.
There's a package up there.
Oh, really? All right, well, we'll see to it after.
When Pepper's not
All right.
trying to get out.
Okay. In that respect, how unlike dear Mrs. Elton, who wants to be wiser and wittier than all the world. I wonder how she speaks of the Coles, what she calls them. How can she find any appellation for them, deep enough in familiar vulgarity? She calls you Knightley. What can she do for Mr. Cole? And I am not so surprised that Jane Fairfax accepts her civilities and consents to be with her. Mrs. Weston, your argument weighs most with me. I can much more readily enter into the temptation of getting away from Miss Bates than I can believe in the triumph of Miss Fairfax's mind over Mrs. Elton. I have no faith in Mrs. Elton's acknowledging herself the inferior in thought, word, or deed, or in her being under any restraint beyond her own scanty rule of good breeding. I cannot imagine that she will not be continually insulting her visitor with praise, encouragement, and offers of service, that she will not be continually detailing her magnificent intentions, from the procuring her a permanent situation to the including her in those delightful exploring parties which are to be taken place in the barouche landau. Jane Fairfax has feeling, said Mr. Knightley. I do not accuse her of want of feeling. Her sensibilities, I suspect, are strong, and her temper excellent in its power of forbearance, patience, self-control, but it wants openness. She is reserved, more reserved, I think, than she used to be, and I love an open temper. No, till Cole alluded to my supposed attachment, it had never entered my head. I saw Jane Fairfax, and conversed with her, with admiration and pleasure always, but with no thought beyond. Well,
once again, he thinks that every man is like him.
Yeah. Well, Mrs. Weston, said Emma triumphantly when he had left them, what do you say now to Mr. Knightley's marrying Jane Fairfax? Why, really, dear Emma, I say that he is so very much occupied by the idea of not being in love with her that I should not wonder if it were to end in his being so at last. Do not beat me. A weird way to end the chapter.
That is, yes.
But honestly, that she does make a good point. As they say, the longest no is the surest yes.
Mm.
People who have seen an adaptation of this or read the book before know the real reason that he took such a long time saying no. But I don't blame Mrs. Weston for...
Oh, right.
Well, I guess I think I know why. Oh, right. And any spoilers, they should have gotten an audiobook from the library.
That is true. That's true.
We certainly didn't hold back on spoilers when I was reading Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah.
All right, chapter 34. Everybody in and about Highbury who had ever visited Mr. Elton was disposed to pay him attention on his marriage. Dinner parties and evening parties were made for him and his lady, and invitations flowed in so fast that she had soon the pleasure of apprehending they were never to have a disengaged day. I see how it is, said she. I see what a life I am to lead among you. Upon my word, we shall be absolutely dissipated. We really seem quite the fashion. If this is living, need not have been at loss. No invitation came amiss to her. Her Bath habits made evening parties perfectly natural to her, and Maple Grove had given her a taste for dinners. She was a little shocked at the want of 2 drawing rooms, at the poor attempt at rout cakes, and there being no ice in the Highbury card parties. No ice. Literally no ice? Or is that
It
figure
could
of speech?
refer to ices. Like,
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if it refers to like ice water or if it refers to ice as like
a frozen
like
dessert.
yeah.
Yeah. I was honestly, I'm so unclear. I don't know if she could mean either of those things or
it's something else entirely.
Yeah, like no ice in the card parties. I almost wonder if that means no, like people were just being too friendly at cards and not being competitive enough or something like that. I don't know.
I don't know. I
literally have no idea. Literally. Oh, hello, Aaron. Aaron says, route cakes. Yeah, it's ROUT-cakes. I don't know what that is.
Interesting.
But apparently there was a poor attempt at them.
Yes. Cannot have that.
Mrs. Bates, Mrs. Perry, Mrs. Goddard, and others were a good deal behindhand in knowledge of the world, but she would soon show them how everything ought to be arranged. I think that's all just supposed to show that, like, being in the country, they're a little or a little behind, like, whatever the current trends in Bath or whatever. In the course of the spring, she must return their civilities by one very superior party, in which her card tables should be set out with their separate candles and unbroken packs in the true style, and more waiters engaged for the evening than their own establishment could furnish, to carry round the refreshments at exactly the proper hour and in the proper order. Emma, in the meanwhile, could not be satisfied without a dinner at Hartfield for the Eltons. They must not do less than the others, or she should be exposed to odious suspicions and imagined capable of pitiful resentment. A dinner there must be. After Emma had talked about it for 10 minutes, Mr. Woodhouse felt no unwillingness, and only made the usual stipulation of not sitting at the bottom of the table himself, with the usual regular difficulty of deciding who should do it for him. I assume there's a draft there.
Yeah, probably.
The persons to be invited required little thought. Besides the Eltons, it must be the Westons and Mr. Knightley. So far, it was all of course. And it was hardly less inevitable that poor little Harriet must be asked to make the 8th. But this invitation was not given with equal satisfaction, and, on many accounts, Emma was particularly pleased by Harriet's begging to be allowed to decline it. She would rather not be in his company more than she could help it. She was not quite able to see him and his charming, happy wife together without feeling uncomfortable. If Miss Woodhouse would not be displeased, she would rather stay at home. It was precisely what Emma would have wished, had she deemed it possible enough for wishing. She was delighted with the fortitude of her little friend. For fortitude she knew it was in her to give up being in company and stay at home, and she could now invite the very person whom she really wanted to make the 8th, Jane Fairfax. Since her last conversation with Mrs. Weston, Mr. Knightley, she was more conscience-stricken about Jane Fairfax than she had often been. Mr. Knightley's words dwelt with her. He had said that Jane Fairfax received attentions from Mrs. Elton, which nobody else paid her. Yeah, we know, Emma. We were there. It was just last chapter. This is very true, said she, at least as far as relates to me, which was all that was meant, and it is very shameful. Of the same age, and always knowing her, I ought to have been more her friend. She will never like me now. I have neglected her too long, but I will show her greater attention than I have done. Surprised that all it took was Mr. Knightley pointing it out. And all of a sudden she's like, oh yeah, I have been a total jerk to Jane Fairfax, like our entire lives, just because I resented that people assumed we should be friends.
Yeah. Maybe having it pointed out that Mrs. Elton was Jane's only other recourse.
Yeah.
Brought home the shame of it or something.
Yeah. I guess, yeah. I mean.
But she is sensitive to what Mr. Knightley thinks.
Yes, she's very sensitive to Mr. Knightley's opinions. And also the idea that she has been, she might be thought generally to have been rude to Jane Fairfax would carry some weight for her as well.
Yeah.
Every invitation was successful. They were all disengaged and all happy. The preparatory interest of this dinner, however, was not yet over. A circumstance rather unlucky occurred. The 2 eldest little Knightleys were engaged to pay their grandpapa and aunt a visit of some weeks in the spring, and their papa now proposed bringing them, and staying 1 whole day at Hartfield, which one day would be the very day of this party. His professional engagements could bear, and here would be a 9th, and Emma apprehended that it would be a 9th very much out of humor of not being able to come even to Hartfield for 48 hours without falling in with a dinner party. She comforted her father better than she could comfort herself, by representing that though he certainly would make them 9, yet he always said so little that the increase of noise would be very immaterial. She thought it in reality a sad exchange for herself, to have him, with his grave looks and reluctant conversation, opposed to her instead of his brother. The event was more favorable to Mr. Woodhouse than to Emma. John Knightley came, but Mr. Weston was unexpectedly summoned to town and must be absent on the very day. He might be able to join them in the evening, but certainly not to dinner. Mr. Woodhouse was quite at ease, and the seeing him so, with the arrival of the little boys and the philosophic composure of her brother on hearing his fate, removed the chief of even Emma's vexation. The day came, the party were punctually assembled, and Mr. John Knightley seemed early to devote himself to the business of being agreeable. Instead of drawing his brother off to a window while they waited for dinner, he was talking to Miss Fairfax. Mrs. Elton, as elegant as lace and pearls could make her, he looked at in silence. Well, that is harsh. She was an old acquaintance and a quiet girl, and he could talk to her. He had met her before breakfast as he was returning from a walk with his little boys, when it had been just beginning to rain. It was natural to have some civil hopes on the subject, and he said, "I hope you did not venture far, Miss Fairfax, this morning, and I am sure you must have been wet. We scarcely got home in time. I hope you turned directly." "I went only to the post office," said she, "and reached home before the rain was much. It is my daily errand. I always fetch the letters when I am here. It saves trouble, and is something to get me out. A walk before breakfast does me good." That's some boring conversation there, Jane. Not a walk in the rain, I should imagine.
"No, but it did not absolutely rain when I set out."
Mr. John Knightley smiled and replied, "That is to say, you chose to have your walk, for you were not 6 yards from your own door when I had the pleasure of meeting you. And Henry and John had seen more drops than they could count long before. The post office has a great charm at one period of our lives. When you have lived to my age, you will begin to think letters are never worth going through the rain for." How old are you?
No, right.
There was a little blush, and then this answer: "I must not hope to be ever situated as you are, in the midst of every dearest connection, and therefore I cannot expect that simply growing older should make me indifferent about letters."
Indifferent? Oh no, I never conceived you could become indifferent. Letters are no matter of indifference. They are generally a very positive curse.
"You are speaking of letters of business. Mine are letters of friendship."
"I have often thought them the worse of the two," replied he coolly. "Business, you know, may bring money, but friendship hardly ever does."
Wow. Dude.
You are not serious now. I know Mr. John Knightley too well. I'm very sure he understands the value of friendship as well as anybody. I can easily believe that letters are very little to you, much less than to me, but it is not your being 10 years older than myself which makes the difference. It is not age, but situation. You have everybody dearest to you always at hand. I probably never shall again, and therefore, till I have outlived all my affections, a post office, I think, must always have power to draw me out, in worse weather than today.
"When I talked of your being altered by time, by the progress of years," said Mr. John Knightley, "I meant to imply the change of situation which time usually brings. I consider one as including the other. Time will generally lessen the interest of every attachment not within the daily circle, but that is not the change I had in view for you. As an old friend, you will allow me to hope, Miss Fairfax, that 10 years hence you may have as many concentrated objects as I have." Concentrated objects, that's a strange euphemism for children.
Is it just children, or is it...
No, I don't think he actually meant it
I
that
think
way.
it's like family.
Yeah, I know. I just thought it sounded kind of funny.
It does.
I like saying, "I hope you shall bear many children. I hope you will have as many concentrated objects as I have."
It was kindly said, and very far from giving offense. A pleasant "thank you" seemed meant to laugh it off, but a blush, a quivering lip, a tear in the eye showed it was felt beyond a laugh.
Who is watching her this closely, Emma?
Apparently, Emma. I was wondering why Jane was giving us this much conversation between two people who are not... I mean, Emma has to be watching them.
Yeah.
Her attention was now claimed by Mr. Woodhouse, who, being, according to his custom on such occasions, making the circle of his guests, and paying his particular compliments to the ladies, was ending with her, and with all his mildest urbanity said,
"I am very sorry to hear, Miss Fairfax, of your being out this morning in the rain. Young ladies should take care of themselves. Young ladies are delicate plants. They should take care of their health and their complexion. My dear, did you change your stockings?"
"Yes, sir, I did indeed, and I am very much obliged by your kind solicitude about me."
"My dear Miss Fairfax, young ladies are very sure to be cared for. I hope your good grandmamma and aunt are well. They are some of my very old friends. I wish my health allowed me to be a better neighbor. You do us a great deal of honor today, I am sure. My daughter and I are both highly sensible of your goodness, and have the greatest satisfaction in seeing you at Hartfield."
The kind-hearted, polite old man might then sit down and feel that he had done his duty, and made every fair lady welcome and easy. By this time the walk in the rain had reached Mrs. Elton, and her remonstrances? Remonstrances. Oof, it's been a long time since I encountered that word. Now opened upon Jane.
Actually, I'm not 100% sure that's how to pronounce it. But
Yeah, I know. I know remonstrating,
yeah.
but not remonstrances.
I don't know if it's one of those
remonstrances.
Words that the emphasis changes when it's...
Yeah, it seems like it must be. I don't know. My dear Jane. Oh, this is Mrs. Elton. Sorry, sometimes it's hard to track who's talking.
Yes.
My dear Jane, what is this I hear? Going to the post office in the rain? This must not be, I assure you. You sad girl, how could you do such a thing? It is a sign I was not there to take care of you.
It's a sign.
Sign.
Yeah,
like a sign that I was not there to take it.
I mean, it's a fact that she wasn't there.
Well, I think she's like, you would never have done that if I had been there, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Jane very patiently assured her she had not caught any cold. "Oh, do not tell me. You really are a very sad girl, and I do not know how to take care of yourself. To the post office, indeed. Mrs. Weston, did you ever hear the like? You and I must positively exert our authority." Married women, you know. "My advice," said Mrs. Weston, kindly and persuasively, "I certainly do feel tempted to give. Miss Fairfax, you must not run such risks. Liable as you have been to severe colds, indeed, you ought to be particularly careful, especially at this time of year. The spring, I always think, requires more than common care. Better wait an hour or two, or even half a day for your letters, than run the risk of bringing on your cough again. Do not you feel that you had? Yes, I am sure you are much too reasonable. You look as if you would not do such a thing again." "Oh, she shall not do such a thing again," eagerly rejoined Mrs. Elton. "We will not allow her to do such a thing again," and nodded significantly. "There must be some arrangement made. There must indeed. I shall speak to Mr. E., the man who fetches our letters every morning. One of our men, I forget his name, shall inquire for yours too and bring them to you. That will obviate all difficulties, you know. And from us, I really think, my dear Jane, you can have no scruple to accept such an accommodation." Wow, one of our men, I forget his name.
Seriously. I say one of, but there are several.
I say one of my servants, for there are several.
And also I can't be bothered to remember their names.
Because
Yeah.
I'm one of those. Anyway, here we have an illustration of Mr. Woodhouse kindly asking after Jane Fairfax's health.
Hello.
Oh, shoot. Strangely, I didn't notice that you were in the Instagram. Erin's over here in the YouTube, if you want to come over to YouTube. Let's see, where was I? Mrs. Elton was just being awful. "You are extremely kind," said Jane. "I cannot give up my early walk. I am advised to be out of doors as much as I can. I must walk somewhere." Oh, sorry. I just lost where I was.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. "I must walk somewhere, and the post office is an object. And upon my word, I have scarcely ever had a bad morning before." "My dear Jane, say no more about it. The thing is determined. That is, laughing affectedly. As far as I can presume to determine without the concurrence of my lord and master. You know, Mrs. Weston, you and I must be cautious how we express ourselves. But I do flatter myself, my dear Jane, that my influence is not entirely worn out. If I meet with no insuperable difficulties, therefore, consider that point as settled. Excuse me, said Jane earnestly. I cannot by any means consent to such an arrangement. So needlessly troublesome to your servant. If the errand were not a pleasure to me, it could be done. But it always is when I am not here by my grandmother's. Oh, my dear, but so much as Patty has to do, and it is a kindness to employ our men. Okay.
Patty?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe that's their
maid?
Maybe she suddenly recollected the name.
Yeah, maybe. Jane looked as if she did not mean to be conquered, but instead of answering, she began speaking again to Mr. John Knightley. The post office is a wonderful establishment, said she. The regularity and dispatch of it. If one thinks of all that it has to do and all that it does so well, it is really astonishing. It is certainly very well regulated. So seldom that any negligence or blunder appears, so seldom that a letter among the thousands that are constantly passing about the kingdom is even carried wrong, and not one in a million, I suppose, actually lost. And when one considers the variety of hands, and of bad hands too, that are to be deciphered, it increases the wonder. The clerks grow expert from habit. I actually have often thought this too. Like, I think I have a pretty good hand, as it were. But I still sometimes look at an address I've written and I'm like, is that perfectly clear? A human being has to actually look at this and understand and like send it to the right place, you know? Mm-hmm. The clerks grow expert from habit. They must begin with some quickness of sight and hand, and exercise improves them. If you want any further explanation, continued he, smiling, they are paid for it. That is the key to a great deal of capacity. The public pays and must be served well. The varieties of handwriting were further talked of, and the usual observations made. We all know what the usual observations are about handwriting, right?
Right, yeah.
I have heard it asserted, said John Knightley, that the same sort of handwriting often prevails in a family, and where the same master teaches, it is natural enough. But for that reason, I should imagine the likeness must be chiefly confined to the females, for boys have very little teaching after an early age, and scramble into any hand they can get. Isabella and Emma, I think, do write very much alike. I have not always known their writing apart. Yes, said his brother hesitatingly, there is a likeness. I know what you mean, but Emma's hand is the strongest. Aaron says, not true. Yes, well, Aaron, I'm pretty convinced you have dysgraphia. Because your handwriting has not... yeah, I'm not trying to be mean, but just,
Dysgraphia?
Yeah, it's like,
where you have trouble, like dyslexia, but...
It's kind of like dyslexia, but instead of hard difficulty reading, it's difficulty writing. You're just like, you know what the letter looks like in your head, but you have a hard time making it happen with your hands. Okay. Aaron says his handwriting has not improved since age 8. Yeah, remember when Mom and Dad were convinced that it was you using the computer too much that it was making your handwriting not improve? And so one summer, they forced you to write a sheet of just anything you wanted, but you had to write a sheet of paper before you could go outside to play for like a whole summer.
Did it become illegible towards the end, or?
I just think it didn't change at all. I don't think it really made a difference. But you've seen my friend Ryan's handwriting. I think Aaron, and he has the same. He's the one who introduced me to the idea of dysgraphia. I'd never heard of it before. Mm. And speaking of Ryan Johnson's handwriting is similarly, looks like an 8-year-old's. So I'm pretty sure you all suffer from dysgraphia. Anyway, that was a tangent.
It doesn't look too bad.
But it doesn't look so much like a grown adult. We're looking at a poster I have on the wall that I guess signed. Anyway. I've seen more evidence of his handwriting than just that.
That is
I'm
fair.
pretty sure. I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure all y'all got dysgraphia. All right, where were we?
Think of how horrible that must have been having that condition, like back when having like good penmanship was like a thing. I mean, now we were even people my age and around that age were still, forced to learn cursive. I don't know if they still do in schools, teach them cursive. But it used to be way more serious. Having good handwriting.
Yeah.
Reasonable, since they didn't have any other way to write things down. Where are we? Oh, yes, Mr. Knightley just said Emma has a very nice hand.
A stronger hand.
A stronger hand than Isabella.
Isabella and Emma both write beautifully, said Mr. Woodhouse, and always did. And so does poor Mrs. Weston.
With half a sigh and half a smile at her.
I never saw any gentleman's handwriting,
Emma began, looking also at Mrs. Weston, but stopped on perceiving that Mrs. Weston was attending to someone else, and the pause gave her time to reflect.
Now, how am I going to introduce him? Am I unequal to speaking his name at once before all these people? Is it necessary for me to use any roundabout phrase? Your Yorkshire friend? Your correspondent in Yorkshire? That will be the way, I suppose, if I were very bad. No, I can pronounce his name without the smallest distress. I certainly get better and better. Now for it.
Mrs. Weston was disengaged, and Emma began again.
Mr. Frank Churchill writes one of the best gentleman's hands I ever saw.
She was going to refer to Mr. Frank Churchill as your Yorkshire friend.
I heard that. I was about to suggest a Derbyshire friend.
I know, just like Aunt Gardner referring to Mr. Darcy as your Derbyshire friend.
It's a thing.
It's a thing. Officially a thing.
I do not admire it, said Mr. Knightley. It is too small, wants strength. It is like a woman's handwriting.
Oh, God.
Whoa, that's the worst thing Mr. Knightley said in the book so far.
Yeah.
This was no means wanted strength. It was not a large hand, but very clear and certainly strong. Had not Mrs. Weston any letter about her to produce? No, she had heard from him very lately, but having answered the letter, she had put it away. If we were in the other room, said Emma, if I had my writing desk, I am sure I could produce a specimen. I have a note of his. Do you remember Mrs. Weston employing him to write for you one day? He chose to say he was employed. Well, I have that note, and can show it after dinner to convince Mr. Knightley.
This implies that Frank Churchill hasn't written a letter to Emma. Would it have been inappropriate for him to write to her? I would have expected him to write her a letter. But maybe it would have been inappropriate for him to write to...
Possibly. I don't know. It would certainly be talked about, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would be inappropriate.
Yeah. It might have been a very decided declaration.
Yeah. I mean, in all reality, he's doubtless not thinking about, yeah.
But still.
He's not thinking about her.
Oh, when a gallant young man like Mr. Frank Churchill,
said Mr. Knightley dryly,
writes to a fair lady like Miss Woodhouse, he will, of course, put forth his best.
Dinner was on table. Mrs. Elton, before she could be spoken to, was ready, and before Mr. Woodhouse had reached her with his request to be allowed to hand her into the dining parlor, was saying, "Must I go first? I really am ashamed of always leading the way." Jane's solicitude about fetching her own letters had not escaped Emma. She had heard and seen it all, and felt some curiosity to know whether the wet walk of this morning had produced any. She suspected that it had, that it would not have been so resolutely encountered, but in full expectation of hearing from someone very dear, and that it had not been in vain. She thought there was an air of greater happiness than usual, a glow both of complexion and spirits. She could have made an inquiry or two as to the expedition and the expense of the Irish mails. It was at her tongue's end, but she abstained. She was quite determined not to utter a word that should hurt Jane Fairfax's feelings, and they followed the other ladies out of the room, arm in arm, and with an appearance of goodwill highly becoming to the beauty and grace of each. And on that note, we finish chapter 34, and next 35 will be our chapter we will read tomorrow. Thank you. Oh, my video on Instagram just ended.
Oh.
I'll have to let Strangely know in the future that, like, if you watch on Instagram, you may get cut off at some point.
Oh, yeah.
Because I started it early and I'm going to start doing that. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Like, with my current progress, if I don't like get sick or suddenly run into some super long or super short chapters or whatever, I'll be finishing up right at the end of May, which will be nice timing. And then I will be taking a week off from reading to decide if I want to do something else, and if so, what I want to do. I think I'll probably do something else, but I haven't decided what book it will be. If you have a genre in mind or any feedback, if you would like to hear me read another book and you would like it to be another Austen, or specifically not another Austen, another...
Anything but Austen.
Well, you know, if you want me to branch out and do something different, there was some talk about maybe reading a Lord Peter Wimsey novel, which is a British mystery novels from like the 20s, the 30s.
Also very wordy, but different time period.
Yes, yeah. Different, also British, also very wordy, lovely prose to read, but definitely a different time period.
No.
A little easier to read.
A little bit.
Than Regency English.
There's still a little bit of the supposition that you know the culture.
Oh, yeah. A lot of that.
Yeah.
Gaudy Night in particular is like, half of it is references to like classic literature and like Latin.
Right.
Like that, the final line of that book, I had to read an entire article to understand why it's super meaningful. And it requires understanding Latin grammar.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Have you read about that? Like,
I haven't read about that.
when he asks her and she
there's-
answers in Latin, the way when I first read it, I just said, oh, well, I assume I know what her answer is. And so that must be that in Latin. And then I read it, and apparently the way she conjugated the phrase gives like subtext to how she was feeling. Dorothy Sayers, what are you doing?
I haven't read that, but I have read a couple other books or stories in which intimate, like fluent knowledge of French is necessary to understanding load-bearing things.
Yeah, I still really enjoyed Gaudy Night. I've read it twice. However, the first time I read it...
very much written for her set of people.
Yes, exactly. It takes place at, what is it, Oxford?
I believe
Cambridge?
It's... whichever one was the corresponding girls' school or women's college.
Yeah. But it was on the campus of one of the other, wasn't it? Anyway, Cambridge. Anyway, it was at one of those schools, you know. Anywho, on that tangent, we will wrap up for today. Also, if you go into the list of my upcoming live streams on my YouTube account, you will see I have made pages for all of the upcoming Emma readings and my next upcoming concert. So everything through the end of May now has a page, and you can click set reminder if you'd like, and YouTube will ping you a little reminder when I go live, if that would be helpful to anyone. So thanks for listening, and I will see you all hopefully tomorrow.